At 7:42 a.m., August 17, 1943, a single mechanic on a muddy New Guinea airstrip made a choice the Army Air Forces would call reckless. A rookie P-38 pilot was launching into 18 Japanese Zeros, and everyone knew he wouldn't survive a turning fight. The aircraft was fast, deadly in a dive, yet crippled by one fatal flaw: a tiny delay in the controls that killed pilot after pilot. So the mechanic installed an unauthorized fix no bigger than a matchstick, a fix no engineer approved. And in the next 17 minutes, it would change the way America fought the Zero. He knew this fighter like the back of his hand. Twin-engine, twin-boom design, built for speed in a straight line, an absolute powerhouse at high altitude. Yet it had one deadly flaw, a weakness that had already cost American pilots their lives. The P-38 simply couldn't outturn a Zero. Lighter, faster, impossibly agile, the Zero could complete a full horizontal turn in half the time it took the P-38. That split-second advantage was often fatal. Doctrine was clear. Never get caught in a turning fight with one. Never try to outmaneuver them. Use speed. Gain altitude. Dive, fire, then climb back out. Strike fast, then vanish. Avoid turning fights at all costs. Hayes had followed this doctrine 5 times, and each attempt had failed. The Zeros were too cunning, too fast. They lured American pilots into tight turns, slipped inside their radius, and landed on their tails. The cost was staggering. The 5th Air Force had lost 37 P-38s in just 6 weeks. Most were lost after being trapped in turning fights they couldn't escape. McKenna had seen too many good men die. Kids, really, full of confidence one moment and gone the next. They climbed into their P-38s believing in the doctrine, yet many never returned or came back in boxes. Manuals blamed pilot error. Instructors said they weren't following procedure. But McKenna knew the truth. The pilots weren't at fault. The real culprit was hidden inside the aircraft itself, the control cables. The P-38's aileron control cables ran from the twin booms to the tail, then forward through pulleys to the wing surfaces. There was slack, tiny, just over 1/3 of an inch at full deflection, but even that small gap caused a dangerous delay between the pilot's stick input and the plane's response. At high speeds, it barely mattered, but in tight, low-speed turning maneuvers, that fraction of a second could mean the difference between life and death. That tiny fraction of a second could mean the difference between rolling inside a Zero's turn or being shot down. 2 months earlier, McKenna had raised the issue with the engineering officer. The response: the cable tension was within factory specifications. That small slack was allowed, part of normal tolerances. Any adjustment would void the aircraft warranty, and in any case, no field mechanic had the authority to alter the flight controls. Such changes required engineering approval from Lockheed, all the way across the country, 7,000 miles away in California. So McKenna took a risk that broke every rule in the Army Air Force maintenance manual. He grabbed a piece of piano wire from a damaged plane, cut it to 6 inches, bent it into a Z shape, and installed it as a tensioner on Lieutenant Hayes's left aileron cable. The entire modification took just 8 minutes, adding 0.4 pounds of tension and eliminating the slack completely. No one noticed. That morning, the inspection crew was too focused on engine oil levels and ammunition to check the cable tension. McKenna said nothing. He watched Hayes taxi to the runway, watched him lift off and vanish into the morning sky, heading straight for the Japanese fighters. What unfolded in the next 17 minutes would change the way every P-38 in the Pacific theater was flown. The first pilot, McKenna, had lost to a Zero, was Lieutenant David Chen back on July 9, 1943. Chen had been in the theater just 3 weeks. McKenna had worked on his aircraft every morning. They shared stories about California, Chen from Sacramento, McKenna from Long Beach. Both had worked on cars before the war. That morning, Chen took off at 6:15 a.m. on a fighter sweep. 2 hours later, he returned with 3 bullet holes in his left boom and a chilling tale of a Zero that had slipped inside his turn. Chen said he tried to roll and dive away exactly as the manual instructed, but the plane felt sluggish, responding slower than it should, like there was a delay between his stick input and the aircraft's movement. A Zero nearly had him. The only thing that saved him was his wingman, who shot the Zero off his tail at the last moment. McKenna examined the bullet holes. They were tightly grouped, perfect deflection shooting. Every mark told a story, and it confirmed what McKenna had feared. The aircraft itself had betrayed its pilot. The Zero pilot had anticipated Chen perfectly, predicting exactly where his P-38 would be. That shouldn't have been possible if Chen had rolled and dived as instructed, unless the aircraft itself had delayed just enough to give the Zero the lead it needed. Chen never flew again. His plane was sent back to the depot for repairs, and McKenna never saw him. 3 weeks later, he learned Chen had been killed in a different P-38 over Rabaul. Same story, caught in a turning fight, unable to roll out fast enough. The next pilot was Captain William Morrison, a seasoned flight leader with 11 confirmed kills. He knew the P-38 inside and out and understood its limits. He flew smart, calculated, precise. On August 3rd, Morrison's flight intercepted 8 Zeros at 12,000 feet over Oro Bay. Morrison scored 1 on the first pass and turned for another attack. 2 Zeros reversed on him. McKenna later listened to the radio traffic. Morrison had tried to roll inverted and perform a split S maneuver, but his controls felt sluggish. The Zeros stayed glued to him through the turn and shot him down at 4,000 feet. His wingman reported it looked as if Morrison's aircraft wasn't responding fast enough, as if he was fighting the controls. Morrison didn't survive the crash. His crew chief, Rodriguez from Texas, and a close friend of McKenna, was convinced something was wrong with the aircraft. After recovering the wreckage, he inspected everything: engine settings, control surfaces, cable tensions. Every system was within specification. Officially, it was ruled pilot error. Rodriguez didn't buy it. Neither did McKenna. By mid-August, McKenna had watched 17 pilots die. Some of them men he knew well. Others he had worked alongside every day. Each loss weighed heavier than the last. Most of the pilots he had only met briefly during pre-flight checks, yet he had worked on every one of their aircraft. He had signed off their maintenance logs, watched them taxi out, watched them take off. Some returned, some never did. The ones who came back told the same story. The P-38 felt sluggish in tight maneuvers, a slight delay between stick input and the aircraft's response. Most pilots assumed it was just the nature of a heavy fighter with large control surfaces. But McKenna knew better. This wasn't normal. He had felt that delay with his own hands while working on the control cables, the tiniest bit of slack in the system. McKenna began listening closely to the sound the cables made during maintenance. There was a distinct tone, a low twang when plucked. Loose cables sounded different from tight ones. McKenna could hear the difference. Every P-38 on the line had cables that were slightly loose, still within spec, but loose. One evening, after Morrison's death, he mentioned his observations to Rodriguez. Rodriguez asked what could be done. McKenna replied, "Nothing officially, but unofficially there was a fix. It would require braking regulations that could get us both court-martialed. The problem wasn't a lack of knowledge. American pilots knew exactly what to do. Every briefing hammered it in. Every training flight drilled it. Never turn with a zero. Use speed. Gain altitude. Strike fast and pull out. The doctrine was clear, but the planes weren't always listening. The problem was that combat rarely followed doctrine. Lieutenant Robert Hayes had been in New Guinea for 2 months. A 23-year-old farmkin from Iowa, he had flown 6 combat missions and still had 0 kills. Not because he lacked skill, but because following the rules often left him in the wrong position. On his 3rd mission, Hayes dove on a zero from altitude, building speed to 400 miles per hour, coming in from the sun just as the manual instructed. He got the zero in his sights and began calculating the lead for a deflection shot. The zero snap-rolled left and dropped into a dive. Hayes tried to match the move, but his P-38 felt heavy, like the wings were pushing through wet sand. By the time he brought the nose around, the enemy fighter had vanished. No shot, no chance. The 4th mission was worse. Hayes and his wingman pounced on 2 zeros at 15,000 feet. Hayes fired the first burst and missed. The zero flipped hard to the right. Hayes rolled to follow, but his wingman suddenly shouted, 2 more zeros diving in from above. Hayes tried to level out and dive away, exactly as trained. The P-38 responded, but just slowly enough for one of the diving zeros to land a 3-second burst into Hayes's right boom. 20-millimeter cannon shells. They didn't punch through, but they rattled him so badly he pulled out of the fight and limped home with both engines smoking. On the 5th mission, Hayes watched his wingman die. Lieutenant Thomas Parker, 21 years old, from Boston. They had trained together, eaten together, survived their first combat weeks side by side. On August 14th, Parker became separated during a dogfight over Finchhaven. 2 zeros locked onto his tail. Parker tried everything. Parker rolled hard, reversed, even tried to scissor. The zeros clung to him through every move. Hayes heard him over the radio, calling for help, voice tightening with panic. Heard him say his aircraft wasn't turning fast enough. Then the gunfire. Then Parker's scream, and then silence. Hayes didn't sleep that night. Most of the squadron didn't either. Parker's bunk stayed empty. His belongings were quietly boxed up and sent home. P-38 was listed as a combat loss, the maintenance report ending with the same cold line as always. No mechanical faults detected. The official report blamed Parker's death on pilot error during defensive maneuvering. McKenna didn't buy a word of it. He had serviced Parker's aircraft that very morning. Engine timing perfect, control surfaces aligned, cable tension exactly within spec. On paper, the airplane was flawless. But Parker still died, and McKenna knew the truth. That split-second delay in the controls, the tiny bit of slack the manual claimed was acceptable, had killed Parker just as surely as it had killed Morrison, Chen, and 14 others. What haunted McKenna most wasn't the paperwork. It was the smell. Every morning, as McKenna stepped into the maintenance bay, the same mix of aviation fuel, hot metal, and hydraulic fluid hit him. A harsh reminder that B's machines were headed back into combat. Some would return, many wouldn't. And every dawn, McKenna stood in the same place, breathing the same smells, working on more aircraft, watching more pilots walk toward machines that couldn't always respond fast enough to save them. On the evening of August 16th, Hayes walked into the maintenance area and found McKenna working on his P-38. Hayes asked if there was anything McKenna could do to make the aircraft roll faster. Anything at all. He didn't care about regulations. He just wanted a fighting chance. McKenna looked at him and saw the truth written across his face. Fear, exhaustion, desperation. The look of a young pilot who knew he wouldn't survive another mission unless something changed. McKenna told him to come back in the morning. He'd see what he could do. That night, McKenna stayed behind alone. After 2,300 hours, the maintenance hangar went silent. Most of the crew was asleep. Only the distant hum of generators and the soft buzz of insects around the overhead lights kept him company as he worked. The air hung thick with engine oil and tropical humidity. McKenna removed the inspection panel from the left boom of Hayes's P-38, the metal still warm from the day's heat. Inside, the aileron control cable snaked through a line of pulleys toward the tail. He wrapped both hands around the cable and pulled. There it was, the slack, nearly 3/8 of an inch before the tension engaged. His hands were covered in grease, his fingers aching from a full day's work, but he could feel that looseness as clearly as a heartbeat. It wasn't just out of place, it was wrong, and he knew it. The piano wire came from a wrecked P-38 that had ground-looped 2 weeks earlier. The aircraft was scrap, but McKenna had stripped anything useful before it was hauled to the depot, including a 6-inch length of high-tensile piano wire from the rudder trim system. He'd thrown it into his tool bag without knowing why. Now, he knew. Sitting on the hangar floor, he shaped the wire into a tight Z-form with a pair of pliers. The metal resisted every bend. It slipped twice, once slicing his thumb open on the second attempt. Warm blood smeared across the wire, making it slick, but he kept working. He wasn't stopping. Not tonight. He wiped the blood on his coveralls and kept at it. 8 minutes passed before he finally got the bend right. The Z-shaped wire would act as an inline tensioner, adding just enough preload to the cable to eliminate the slack. Installing it was another challenge. The boom was cramped. McKenna had to work with one hand while holding a flashlight in the other. The beam swung constantly, casting jumping shadows across the cable system. His shoulder pressed against the metal structure, edges cutting into his arm, but he didn't stop. Sweat ran down his back despite the cool night air. McKenna disconnected the cable at the pulley junction, fingers fumbling with the clevis pin. It slipped and bounced somewhere inside the cramped boom. 5 tense minutes passed as he groped in the dark until he finally found it. All the while, his heart pounded. If the engineering officer caught him tampering with a flight control system, he could face a court-martial, possibly a dishonorable discharge, maybe even prison. But Hayes would die if McKenna didn't act. He slipped the piano wire tensioner between the cable end and the pulley, then reconnected the cable. The fit was tight. He had to force the clevis pin through. When it finally seated, he tested the tension by hand, pulled on the cable. No slack. The control surface responded instantly. Perfect. McKenna replaced the inspection panel, cleaned his tools, wiped the blood from the wire and his hands, and stepped out of the hangar at 1:15 a.m. The tropical night was humid and still. Somewhere in the distance, he heard engines, Japanese night raiders most likely. The sound made his stomach tighten. He had just modified a flight control system without authorization, used a non-standard part, and broken at least a dozen regulations. If it failed in flight, Hayes would crash, and McKenna would bear full responsibility. But if it worked, Hayes might live. McKenna went to his bunk and didn't sleep, staring at the ceiling until dawn. At 6:30 a.m., he walked to the flight line, watching the crew fuel and arm Hayes's P-38, watched Hayes head out for his pre-flight briefing and climb into the cockpit. At 7:42 a.m., Hayes lifted off. McKenna stood on the flight line, watching the P-38 climb into the morning sky. join formation with 16 other aircraft, and head northwest toward Japanese airspace. All he could do now was wait. The engagement began at 8:14 a.m. Hayes's flight of 4 P-38s intercepted 900 enemy fighters at 13,000 feet over the Hoenn Gulf. The morning sun was at their backs, a perfect setup for a diving attack. Hayes flew in the number 3 position. His element leader called out the bounce. They rolled in. Hayes locked onto a 0 at the rear of the formation. He dove from altitude, building speed to 380 miles per hour. The 0 grew larger in his gun sight. Hayes could see the painted rising sun on the fuselage, the pilot's head in the canopy. He pressed the trigger. Soar .50 caliber machine guns and a single 20mm cannon hammered the enemy aircraft. Tracers streaked through the sky. Most missed. A few hits sparked along the 0's wing, but not enough. The 0 snap-rolled to the right and dove. Hayes rolled to follow, and then he felt it. The P-38 responded instantly. No delay, no lag. The stick moved, and the aircraft rolled immediately. Hayes had never felt his P-38 respond like this. It was as if the airplane had been waiting for his command, executing every move the instant he gave it. He rolled 90 degrees in what felt like half the normal time, nosed down, and the 0 was right there in his sight picture. He fired again, a 3-second burst. Rounds climbed up the 0's fuselage from tail to cockpit. Its engine erupted. Pieces flew off as the aircraft rolled inverted, trailing black smoke toward the jungle below. Hayes had his first kill, but there was no time to celebrate. His wingmen shouted warnings, more 0s diving from above. Hayes looked up and saw 3 0s diving toward him, shallow and fast. They'd seen him take down their comrade, and now they wanted revenge. He shoved the throttles forward, trying to climb, but the 0s were faster in the dive. They'd be on him in seconds. His only choice was to reverse and fight. Every instinct screamed to climb, to run. That was the doctrine. But following doctrine meant dying today. He rolled hard left and pulled. The P-38 snapped around like nothing he had ever felt before. The P-38's nose leveled through the horizon. Hayes spotted the lead 0, turning to follow, but it hadn't expected him to reverse so quickly. The enemy fighter was exposed. Hayes pulled lead, fired, and hit the 0's left wing. The wing folded. The aircraft tumbled. 2 kills in 30 seconds. The other 2 0s tried to scissor with him, alternating turns to force an overshoot. Hayes stayed with them. Every time they reversed, his P-38 snapped into the turn instantly. No lag, no fighting the controls. The aircraft did exactly what he wanted the moment he wanted it. It was like flying a completely different plane, as if invisible weights had been lifted from the control system. 1 0 made a critical mistake, reversed too sharply, bled too much speed. Hayes slid inside its turn. Close range, barely 200 feet. He fired. He couldn't miss. The 0 tore apart, pieces tumbling past his canopy. The P-38 shuddered as debris struck the right boom. 3 kills. The 4th 0 broke off. Hayes didn't pursue. It wasn't worth it. Fuel and ammunition were running low. He climbed back to altitude, reformed with the remnants of his flight, and headed home. The entire engagement had lasted just 7 minutes. When Hayes landed at Doadora at 9:03 a.m., McKenna was waiting on the flight line. Hayes shut down the engines and climbed out, hands trembling, flight suit soaked with sweat. He walked straight to McKenna and said 2 words, "It worked." What neither of them realized was that 6 other pilots had observed Hayes's engagement from above. Captain Frank Mitchell, flight leader of the 475th Fighter Group, watched the entire fight unfold from 15,000 feet. As he tracked Hayes's element against the zeros below, he noticed something unusual, something that would change the way every P-38 in the Pacific was flown. Hayes's P-38 rolled faster than any Lightning Mitchell had ever seen. The aircraft snapped through maneuvers as if it weighed half of what it should. Mitchell knew every pilot in the theater, knew their skills. Hayes was good, but not that good. Something about his airplane was different. After landing, Mitchell found Hayes in the debriefing room. The young pilot was still buzzing with adrenaline, hands shaking as he filled out the combat report. 3 confirmed kills. Mitchell asked him quietly, what was different? Hayes said he didn't know. His airplane had just responded better today, faster, sharper. Mitchell asked if maintenance had done anything. Hayes suggested talking to Technical Sergeant McKenna. 2 hours later, Mitchell found McKenna in the maintenance area. Hands black with grease, coveralls streaked with hydraulic fluid, working on another P-38. Mitchell asked directly, "What did you do to Hayes's airplane?" McKenna studied him for a long moment, then answered plainly, "The piano wire tensioner, the cable modification, the unauthorized change to the flight control system." Mitchell listened, silent, absorbing every word. When McKenna finished, Mitchell asked if the same modification could be applied to his aircraft, but warned him of the risks. The change wasn't approved, hadn't been tested. If anything went wrong, they could both face serious charges. Mitchell didn't care. He had lost 4 pilots in his flight over the past month, each caught in turning fights they couldn't escape. If there was a way to give them a chance to survive, he wanted it. Regulations could wait. That evening, McKenna modified Mitchell's P-38, same piano wire tensioner, same installation method. The next morning, Mitchell flew it and returned raving about the difference. "It rolls like a fighter, not a truck," he told his wingman. The wingman asked McKenna for the same modification. By August 20th, 9 aircraft had been upgraded. Word spread quickly through the squadron. Pilots began asking their crew chiefs if they had heard about the cable modification. Some refused, citing regulations. Others were willing to try. McKenna showed them how. Cut the piano wire, bend it into a Z shape, install it as an inline tensioner, 8 minutes of work that changed everything. The modifications spread quietly, pilot to pilot, mechanic to mechanic. No official documentation, no engineering approval, just whispered conversations in the ready room and maintenance area. Hayes shot down 2 more zeros on August 22nd with the upgraded controls. Mitchell claimed 3 on August 25th. Other pilots began returning from missions with confirmed kills. The results were impossible to ignore. Lieutenant James Watkins, a crew chief with the 49th Fighter Group at Guinea, heard about the modification from a pilot who had transferred from Doadura. Skeptical at first, Watkins tried it on a single aircraft. The pilot returned from his next mission with his first kill in 8 weeks. Encouraged, Watkins modified 4 more aircraft. Soon, other crew chiefs in the 49th began doing the same. By early September, roughly 40 P-38s in New Guinea sported the modification. The engineering officer at Doadura noticed something was different, but couldn't figure out what. Control cable tensions always checked out during inspections because the crew chiefs removed the tensioners before checks and reinstalled them afterward. The pilots knew. The mechanics knew, but the officers didn't. The kill ratio began to shift. In July, American pilots in the Southwest Pacific lost 2 P-38s for every 0 destroyed. In August, it dropped to 1.3 to 1. By September, it was nearly even. Something had changed, but officially, no one knew what. Then the Japanese noticed. Reports of the unexpected shift began arriving from Japanese fighter pilots in late August. Flight reports from the 11th Air Fleet indicated that American P-38s were maneuvering more aggressively, rolling faster into turns, reversing direction with unprecedented speed. Tactics that had worked reliably for months were suddenly failing. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's top aces with 64 confirmed kills, had been fighting American pilots since Pearl Harbor. On September 3, 1943, Sakai engaged a P-38 over Wewak. Sakai used his standard tactic, lured the American into a turning fight, waited for the P-38 to start its roll, then snapped back in the opposite direction to get inside the turning radius. But the P-38 reversed with him. Sakai had executed this maneuver dozens of times. He knew exactly how long a P-38 took to roll, knew the timing perfectly. Yet this aircraft rolled faster than it should have. Sakai barely avoided a head-on collision. The American had guns on him, forcing Sakai to dive away to survive. Sakai returned to base, confused and frustrated. Other experienced Japanese pilots reported similar encounters. The Americans weren't flying differently. They were still using the same tactics, but their aircraft responded faster. Just a fraction, yet enough to matter. Enough to disrupt the timing that Japanese pilots had mastered. Japanese intelligence scrambled to determine what had changed. They examined the wreckage of downed P-38s, but found no obvious modifications. The aircraft looked identical to the ones they had been fighting for months. Engines, armament, everything was the same. Nothing appeared different. What the Japanese didn't know was that the change was hidden inside the boom. A 6-inch piece of piano wire that looked like standard equipment. Even if they had discovered it, they might not have understood its purpose. It wasn't a new weapon, wasn't a new engine, just a minor tweak to the control cable tension. Yet that small change was costing them pilots. By mid-September, Japanese pilots were losing aircraft to P-38s at rates they hadn't seen since the early days of the war. The psychological impact was profound. For 2 years, Zero pilots had dominated turning fights, confident they could outmaneuver any American aircraft. That confidence was eroding. Pilots who once pressed attacks were now cautious, hesitant, unsure if their tactics would succeed. The Japanese tried to adapt, but the P-38s were no longer the same. Some Japanese pilots stopped attempting turning fights with P-38s, opting instead for hit-and-run tactics. But that meant surrendering their main advantage. The Zero's strength was maneuverability. Fighting like a P-38 meant fighting on American terms, and the P-38 was faster, more heavily armed, and could endure more damage. Others tried to compensate with increased aggression, closing to shorter range, taking more risks. But aggression without the ability to outturn the enemy only meant dying faster. Several experienced Japanese pilots were killed in September attempting tactics that had worked flawlessly in July. The fundamental problem was that they were fighting an enemy they couldn't see. They knew something had changed, but they didn't know what, and they couldn't figure out how to counter it. You can't develop tactics against a modification you don't even know exists. By the end of September, the 11th Air Fleet had lost 38 fighters in combat against P-38s. American losses in the same period were just 22 aircraft. The ratio had reversed. For the first time in the Pacific War, P-38s were defeating Zeros at better than a 1-to-1 rate. Japanese command issued strict orders. Avoid engaging P-38s unless you held a significant numerical advantage. That directive marked a turning point. The zero had gone from hunter to hunted, and it all came down to a single piece of piano wire installed by hand, unauthorized, and never officially documented. The Army Air Force Engineering Command learned of the modification in October 1943. A maintenance inspector at Dodora noticed inconsistent cable tension readings and traced the discrepancies to the piano wire tensioners. He filed a report, sending it up the chain of command. The report sat on desks for 3 weeks as officers debated what to do. The modification violated regulations, but it was working. Fighter squadrons using the modification were achieving measurably higher kill ratios. Pilots were surviving missions that would have been fatal before. The question wasn't whether the modification worked. It clearly did. The dilemma was whether to punish the mechanics who installed it without authorization or quietly approve it after the fact. In November, Lockheed dispatched an engineering team to New Guinea to evaluate the change. They measured cable tensions, calculated stress loads, and conducted flight tests. The engineers concluded the modification was both safe and effective. It should have been part of the original design. Lockheed incorporated a similar tensioning system into the P-38J model, which entered production in December 1943. But McKenna never received official credit. No commendation, no medal, no mention in any report. Lockheed's documentation attributed the control system improvement to engineering analysis. McKenna's name didn't appear anywhere. Lieutenant Hayes survived the war. He flew 63 combat missions, shot down 11 Japanese aircraft, returned to Iowa in 1945, married his high school sweetheart, had 4 children, and spent 37 years working as a crop duster. Hayes never forgot what McKenna had done. Every year on August 17th, he called McKenna to personally thank him for saving his life. Mitchell also survived. He became a squadron commander, leading his unit through the Philippines campaign and shooting down 16 enemy aircraft. After the war, he remained in the Air Force, retiring as a colonel in 1963. He shared the story of McKenna's modification with every young maintenance officer he supervised, ensuring they understood that sometimes the best solutions come from enlisted mechanics who notice problems the engineers miss. McKenna stayed in the Army Air Force until 1946. Then returned to California. He went back to working on cars and opened his own garage in Long Beach in 1948. For 42 years, he worked on engines, quietly, rarely speaking of the war. When people asked, he'd simply say he was a mechanic, fixed airplanes, that's all. In 1991, a military historian researching P-38 modifications discovered references to the piano wire tensioner in New Guinea maintenance logs. The historian tracked down McKenna through veteran registries. By then, he was 73 years old, still working part-time in his garage. The historian asked McKenna about the modification. He confirmed the story, insisting it wasn't anything special, just something that needed doing. Based on improved survival rates in squadrons that used it, the historian estimated that the modification may have saved 80 to 100 American pilots' lives. McKenna never counted. He just remembered the pilots who came back: Hayes, Mitchell, Watkins, and the others. That was enough. James McKenna passed away in 2006 at the age of 88, leaving behind a quiet legacy that had saved countless lives. A date written on the back reads August 1943, New Guinea. This is how innovation truly happens in war, not through committees or official channels, but through sergeants and mechanics who spot problems, find solutions, and don't wait for permission to save lives. If you found this story as compelling as we did, take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each story matters, Each one deserves to be remembered. We'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania. From veterans to history enthusiasts, you're part of something truly special. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.